Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to cover pretty much gun control in the US, do a brief summary on it. Now, there's a lot of good resources out there to get more in depth, but I tend to do more overviews of everything, so that's what I want to do here. I'm going to start off with from 1934 to 1994. Those are, of course, the easiest, the federal regulations, the easiest things to find. Where there's, of course, gun control before that and after that. That will be other videos. Those are actually a little bit harder to put into a timeline. So, without further ado, let's get started. Passed into law by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on June 26, 1934, the National Firearms Act was a way to help combat the increased mob violence of the time, as well as many tragedies such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Never mind the fact that the government created the problem by imposing the Prohibition Act, and because they can never let a good tragedy go to waste, we have the National Firearms Act, which imposed regulations and taxes on the manufacturing, selling, and transportation of short-barreled shotguns, short-barreled rifles, machine guns, and, as stated at this time, firearms mufflers. It imposed a $200 tax stamp on the transfer and selling of them, which at this time was pretty much unobtainable for most people. Because the National Firearms Act wasn't enough to stop the gang violence by itself, because it never is, the 1938 Federal Firearms Act was imposed, which required manufacturers, importers, and dealers to need an FFL, a Federal Firearms License, to conduct business. It defined an entire group of people, convicted felons, no matter what their conviction was on, whether violent or non-violent, to no longer be able to own guns. Gun sellers would then have to keep customer records of all their sales. I wanted to add the U.S. versus Miller 1939 Supreme Court case to this, because in its ruling, it certified that the U.S. government had every right to regulate short-barreled shotguns. Following the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., President Lyndon B. Johnson enacted the 1968 Gun Control Act, replacing the 1938 Federal Firearms Act. This added destructive devices and expanded the definition of machine guns. It banned the importing of non-sporting guns, required you to be 21 to buy a handgun. It prohibited felons and the mentally ill from owning firearms. And all manufacturers and importers would then require a serial number on their firearms. It also imposed stricter licensing and regulations on the firearms industry. I encourage you to look more in depth into this act, mainly the reason why it was enacted. But in 1986, signed in by President Ronald Reagan, the Firearm Owner Protection Act, it prohibited a national registry of firearms owners. It limited the ATF inspections to only once a year and allowed selling guns at gun shows of the same state. Now, it also had some negatives, unfortunately. It prohibited ownership and transfer of civilian machine guns produced after May 19, 1986. And it redefined silencers to include parts intended to make them. So this one came with some good and some bad. Here we have an act imposed by our favorite anti-gun president, Bill Clinton. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, or the Brady Bill, Brady Act. This act imposed a background check on all firearms purchased from an FFL, as well as it established the National Instant Criminal Background System, the NICS, which is maintained by the FBI, and is something that pretty much anyone has to do now when purchasing a firearm. I left a picture of a 4473 just so everyone can see it. You have to fill this out when purchasing a firearm. The 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, also known as the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act, or by all of us, we just call it the assault weapons ban. This was also signed into law by our favorite, Bill Clinton. This outlawed the manufacture, transfer, or possession of a semi-automatic assault weapon unless grandfathered in. The bill included 19 named military-style and/or copycat firearms, including the AR-15, the Tech-9, the MAC-10. It imposed a magazine limit of 10 rounds. Of course, as you can see in this picture, evil features were a no-no. This bill was only in effect for 10 years because that's what it was signed into. And government is ineffective and could not get it on President George W. Bush's desk to extend it. So in 2004, it was repealed, which was the accidental start to us getting some of our firearms rights back in this country. In 1995, they would also enact the gun-free zones in schools. But there you have it, guys. 60 years of gun control. And just remember, they will take whatever we allow them to take. Well, this has been my video, part 1. More parts to come. If you disagree with something, if I left out something important, let me know. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, everyone.